Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
We have questions from Ms. Page, Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Chapman. Ms. Page will be 10 minutes, Mr. Jacobs 5 minutes and Mr. Chapman 5 minutes.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think I'm going first.
All right.
Good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of a large number of sub-postmasters who are core participants in this inquiry. I think we've established from your evidence this morning that it's your view that the arm's length model of governance was not a bar to ministerial intervention. And you've given examples, for example, with the nuclear decommissioning authority, government would intervene because it's important to do so. And what our clients are particularly interested to know is what mechanisms within the arm's length body governance mechanism were there for detecting and dealing with situations such as in this case where senior executives acted in bad faith and covered up matters?
I think the principal answer to that has to be the board, because the board of the post office.
Post office board.
Correct, because they are they're our oversight. They are our. They have the time. They have the capacity. They have the knowledge. And their function is to hold the executive to account. If they miss it, then we might just catch it. But I have to say, it's sort of luck if we, if we can pick up on something like this. I mean, that said, we have missed things here, and it was a catastrophe.
We've heard there were mechanisms in place.
Yes.
Shareholder, executive, non-executive directors sitting on the post office board, risk registers, traffic light analysis,
yes.
Heat maps, the shareholder executives risk and assurance committee. With these checks and balances, why was it missed, and who do you blame? What individuals do you blame for not bringing that to your attention?
It's really not for me to blame individuals, but I go back to the point that we do have these various mechanisms, but remember the scale of what it is we're looking after here. 20 organisations, some of them really complex organisations. 20 corporate finance, but a corporate finance project might be the privatisation of Royal Mail. Big things. So no matter how good we are, for us to pick up something like this by ourselves without any prompting from people closer to the organisation, of course it could happen. And I deeply regret it didn't happen. But the reason we promulgate the idea of an arm's length body, as I go back to what I was saying this morning, is in part because of the governance structure of a board. They have the time capacity to be able to dig in areas that are definitely more difficult for us. My interaction with the executive over 6 years, 6 meetings maybe, I would need to be a genius, perhaps. Well, perhaps not. But I mean, I'd certainly need to be really lucky to pick up on some of these points. So there has to be a reliance on other systems.
Well, isn't this the very reason why the shareholder executive put non-executive directors on the post office board to pick these very things up?
Well, only in part. And I go back to the point that the reason we populate these boards with subject matter experts is so they can dig into a financial issue, perhaps an IT issue, although on the Post Office Board we didn't have anybody particularly steeped in IT. We have people reasonably experienced in IT, but not steeped in IT. We don't put people on our board, we don't put our people on boards with particular subject matter experience. They're there, as I explained earlier, primarily to do the function of making sure the organisation doesn't drift off and start doing things that the department doesn't want, and to make sure we've got full sight of the discussion. Yes, of course, they are still full board members, and they are part of, to the extent that there's been a failure of board governance, they're a part of that. You can't get away from that.
Thank you. You answered questions from Ms Price before lunch when you say, referring to paragraph 211 of your statement, that there was information that the shareholder executive knew about, or reasonably to have known about, the Parker Review, the second site final report, and you said that you would have, if you'd been more curious, if you'd taken it as a critical issue, you would have escalated it to the board, you said, you would have had conversations within the department, and you would have gone to have seen ministers. And what our clients are interested to know is when a government-owned body goes rogue, as has happened here, and this could be any other organisation, could do the same thing, nuclear decommissioning, for example, what can the government actually do? Would it go in? Would it dismiss the board? Would it take over? How do you deal with the sort of crisis that we've got here?
So what was the missed opportunity here? The missed opportunity, I believe, and of course this is hindsight, this is having learnt about this this in so much detail post the event, the missed opportunity was back in 2013, was not putting a big professional services firm into the organisation in place of Second Sight to have done a complete review of the system, not just the computer system, the software system, but everything. Because as we know, this was far more about just the system. It was the treatment of sub-postmasters, it was the way people were being dealt with. That was the missed opportunity. Now, could it have been done later? Of course it could have been done later. And would it have bothered me if I'd known the significance of this, that I might have had Post Office or even the board saying this isn't necessary? Not at all. If we thought this was necessary, we would have done it. And we would have done it. We'd have instructed the Post Office to do it.
I think you've accepted, haven't you, there was a failure in governance here.
Yes.
And I think your answer is that a professional services firm would have been a check that could have been inserted. Well,
I mean, given how long it took the GLO to really uncover the issues here, I don't think there'd have been any alternative to something like that, because of course we couldn't possibly have wanted to have gone through all that litigation. It would have been far better to have got to the bottom of it, and because it was very complex in so many respects, you have to have someone in who's capable of getting to it. I don't know any other solution.
Well, thank you for that. I think I'm about to, or I have exceeded my time. I just have one other point.
Yes.
You said in answer to questions from Ms Price before lunch that you weren't aware of the sort of Post Office prosecuting in circumstances where it was the victim, the investigator and the prosecutor.
Yes.
Ron Warmington of Second Sight gave evidence on the 18th of June this year, and one of his criticisms of the way that the investigation was governed effectively was that the Post Office was the principal subject of the investigation, but it was also the paymaster.
Yes. And
he said that Andrew Brigden, I think, raised that, and he said the Treasury said we haven't got any money and therefore the Post Office is going to have to pay for it, and it was a daft decision, which is what the witness said. Why didn't the government spot that and deal with it at the time?
I don't know is the answer. I don't know, because although I've been slightly disparaging of certainly the part of the interim report, clearly Second Sight did get on to some fundamental points there. but we didn't pick them up.
I think I have come to the end of my time. I'm just going to ask if I have more questions. I don't, so that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Page.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Russell, oversight involves a balance of support and challenge. Do you agree?
Yes.
What I want to look at is your team's approach towards Post Office and whether there was really anything like challenge
Yes.
in the attitudes that you brought towards your task. So if we could start, please, by going to UKGI 304-2124. And this is a document that you looked at with Ms. Price, but I want to ask you some different questions on it. And if we could go, please, to page 2 when we get there. This is the February 2014 ARC meeting note where you were in attendance.
Yes.
And Mr. Tim McInnes gave a summary of Project Sparrow. So if we go down to paragraph 14, please. And if we just go over what it says there, Tim McInnes explained that this is with regard to a financial system that is used by sub-postmasters, some of whom have received criminal convictions for misuse. However, the sub-postmasters are suggesting that the actual system was at fault. All the Post Office investigations so far have shown that the system is working correctly. However, the risk is that if this system were to show up as defective, then potentially the criminal convictions could be overturned and compensation from Post Office sought. Now, what I want to ask you about is this. At one level, this summary of Project Sparrow is very incisive because it doesn't have any of the flummery that we sometimes get from Post Office that was really just, one might argue, a distraction to do with the mediation, to do with support for sub-postmasters, and those other issues, because really it focuses very, very tightly on the criminal convictions. And what it says is that if they prove to be, if the system proves to be at fault, then they may be overturned. Now, that is a matter, surely, of very, very high importance. Because what we're talking about here, and what actually is missed here, is that the risk, the real risk, is not whether compensation may be sought. The real risk is that the organisation that you're overseeing may have wrongfully convicted its trusted business partners and sent them to jail. And that was obvious at the time. That's not just a hindsight observation. That's something that any person of integrity should have been able to identify from what was being expressed there by Mr. McInnes. Do you accept that?
I completely accept that.
Now, you tell us that you and your team would have relished uncovering the fact that the sub-postmasters were right. Why do you think that this transparently somewhat misguided summary about compensation didn't get you thinking, didn't get you wondering? Why is nobody wondering about the possibility that postmasters have been sent to prison wrongly?
I think the answer to that is we had no idea of the scale of what was going on here.
It doesn't matter the scale. If
Well,
one person has gone to prison wrongly,
yes,
that is a miscarriage of
it's a matter
justice.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree with that. But I'd say it is in part scale. I agree. Just one person being convicted wrongly is a matter of serious concern, and I'd acknowledge that. And, you know, I can't remember the discussion. I was there. But that in itself, I completely agree. We should have jumped on that. I can only say in mitigation, if this had been, if the indication had been that this was likely, right? So this is an allegation at the moment. If this was likely, and it was on any scale at all, I would like to think we would have jumped on it. But your point is well made. Just one instance, we should have jumped on it.
Thank you. That document can come down. If we could have a look, please, at UKGI 406883. And this is one of the risk registers which uses the heat map, and you've explained that for us, so I won't dwell on that. what I'd like to look at is some of the wording in the way that the risk is described. Looks like we might have... Oh, it is coming, I believe, just a little slowly. Thank you. If we could go to tab 2 and look at risk 6, which is the Project Sparrow risk. It's a little further down, please. Could just keep going up a little to 6. There we go. I don't know how well you can read that, but it says on the left Project Sparrow, and what we can see in column D is a description that I think we may have seen similarly before. So if we go across to E, and what it says there is Post Office's reputation and brand are damaged by accusations. Costs spiral out of control, particularly if legal action is taken. Government risks being drawn closer into the scheme or our level of involvement being made public. And then if we go a bit further across to K, it says responsibility rests with Post Office to manage both the mediation scheme and stakeholders generally. Post Office Chair undertaking review with independent QC. We are managing ministers' involvement with the intention of keeping the issue independent of government. And then finally, across to the one before Q, it doesn't have a heading. Ensure Post Office are proactively managing interests and noise and are aware of ministers' expectations. Manage interest and wobbles from ministers or the centre, including preparing fallback options if current arm's length position becomes untenable. Now, what that says, surely, is the arm's length stance was something of a sham.
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, I've a number of comments on this. First of all, and this is common to all our risk registers on Horizon Sparrow, the risk was not properly articulated. This was the real risk was there was a problem in the system. And that was not captured. This is primarily, and my memory is the concern of the team was that the mediation process was given its best possible chance. You know, if you go back, there was always some sort of process going on to try to resolve this, and we can argue about the adequacy of the process, but there was always some sort of second site mediation scheme Parker. And I think there was a legitimate concern here that either if government got too close to the mediation scheme or it proposed something alternative, then that was the end of the mediation scheme. We know in the end the mediation scheme did collapse, and that's one of the reasons that led to the Parker review. But I think there was a legitimate concern here of the team against the background that the risk was not properly captured here. But in terms of the risk of the mediation scheme falling over, I think there's something quite right here, that the mediation scheme depended upon government keeping at a distance and there being no alternative judicial investigation or whatever that would absolutely have cut the mediation scheme dead.
A private company couldn't have entered into the sort of expensive, ruinous litigation that the Post Office did without a great deal of challenge from its owners, could it?
No. So it couldn't have entered into a...
The sort of expensive, ruinous litigation that Post Office entered into, in a private company, the owners of that business would have been all over it, not leaving it at an arm's length and hoping to be able to get away with that.
Yes, I mean, I don't think the Post Office entered into the litigation on the basis of, well, it doesn't really much matter because the government will be there to bail us out. I think there was a very big concern the government wouldn't be there to bail them out. They, my memory of this is they entered into that litigation absolutely certain right was on their side.
Well, I'm not so concerned about their position. I'm concerned really about the government shareholder position in which the risk is being articulated as, well, we'll only get involved if our arm's length stance becomes untenable. And surely that just doesn't take responsible ownership of the business.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think the mediation scheme had the greatest chance of success if the government was on the sidelines of that, i.e. not involved, not trying to arbitrate, not coming up with its own decision. So I think it was appropriate as an arm's length structure.
Well, thank you, Mr. Russell. I've taken up my time, so I'll end there.
Thank you, Ms. Page. Mr. Chapman.
Is that working? That should be better. Mr. Russell, I have a handful of questions on behalf of the Department for Business and Trade concerning the Post Office's arm's length status and the government's powers to step in and issue directions or otherwise exert its powers. To set the scene, earlier today, Ms. Price took you to paragraph 23 of your witness statement, which refers to the 2012 model of the Articles of Association, where you explain that the articles give the Secretary of State particular rights, including the right to receive information from Pol and the power to appoint or remove the Post Office's directors, including its chair or chief executive. In paragraph 193 of your statement, you discuss the government's reaction to the Common Issues judgment and specifically the government's reaction to Pol's response to the judgment, so the recusal application and so on. And you say at paragraph 193, there's no particular need to get it up on screen, I'll read it out. I've reflected on whether the government could or should have stepped in to insist that the recusal application was not made. This would have been a very serious step to take and would have risked either resignations or dismissals of board members and possibly others. The board had received legal advice supporting a recusal application from extremely eminent legal figures, including a former president of the Supreme Court. In those circumstances, I do not think that it would have been realistic to have expected the government to have stepped in to prevent the application. So the necessary implication of that is that, in your view, the government had the powers to step in and prevent the application from being made. And you said in your evidence shortly before lunch, you had words to the effect, you have no doubt that ministers, as effectively the shareholder, had the power to step in if they wanted to. First question, so far as you know, was that understanding shared by both Czechs and ministers?
That they could step in.
Could step in?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, by stepping in, ultimately, you can remove a board. Ministers knew that.
That's my next question. So
yes.
what do you mean by stepping in, and what are the specific powers, as at this time, mid-2019, for ministers to step in, short of dismissing the board?
Well, the actual power is dismissal of the board. The practical power is a threat to dismiss the board.
Right. Now, we were aware in 2019 of, at the time of the proposed recusal application and the appeal thereof, that Czech's officials had calls with ministers and the Secretary of State, at which the Secretary of State and ministers made very clear their distaste for the idea of a recusal application being made, of an appeal being made, etc., etc. Was that communicated to you?
I think so, yes, yes.
And were you aware thereafter that the Secretary of State asked for advice on the various options available to him to stop the board from carrying through on this idea, and in particular on the nuclear option of, in fact, dismissing the entire Pol board?
Actually, I don't think I was aware of that.
Could you explain now what the downside to dismissing the board of a body like Pol would have been at that time?
Well, it would be a pretty high-profile event. I can't think of any instance where government has dismissed the board of an arm's length body. So it would have been a pretty rare event. Are there downsides? Well, you'd have to find a new board for sure. That may not be straightforward. But no, not. I mean, if ministers felt strongly enough about it, and my understanding was they did feel strongly, but they respected what the directors believed were their own duties at the time. They respected that point, and were not prepared to, take the nuclear option of replacing the board.
So for ministers, it was really, at that time, it was really an all or nothing.
Well, as I say, there's this practical point that you could go to the chair and say, we want this stopped, and if you don't stop it, we're going to remove you, and the chances are they will stop it.
Now, in March 2020, new articles of association were adopted for the Post Office, which, for the first time, gave the Secretary of State a power to issue directions to the Post Office. We don't need to turn it up. Were you aware of that?
To be honest, I can't remember.
Would that...
This is in the new articles.
This is the March 2020 articles.
Articles, yeah.
Would that sort of halfway house provision have been the sort of provision that could have enabled government to step in to prevent the application?
Without threatening the nuclear option? Yes, I think it probably would be. And indeed, I think this is probably the solution. You have, as I say, I don't think you should be constituting a new type of company. I think, if anything, what you should be doing is you should be extending the rights of the shareholder so that you don't have to threaten the nuclear option. I happen to think that's probably the answer.
And to conclude that circle, are there also potential risks to threatening the board or the chair with removal?
Yes. You need to exercise that very carefully. And we've already seen from some of the way ministers look at this, I think there are certainly ministers who absolutely understand the need to have mechanisms in place to ensure that it is actually quite difficult for ministers to get involved, i.e. the bars are quite high. So all of this is a balance.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Is there anyone else, Ms. Price?
No, sir, that's it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Russell, for making your detailed witness statement and for answering questions from a variety of people this morning and this afternoon. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you, sir.
Right, so I will remain online while you do some manoeuvring, Ms.
Thank you,
Price.
sir. Yes, it's Mr. Swannell next.
Yeah. But I'll just remove myself from the video, but I'm still here, so to speak.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. If I can call Mr. Swannell, please.
Yeah.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Make yourself comfortable.
Thanks.
Thank you. Please could you state your full name?
Robert William Ashburnham Swannell.
Thank you for attending the inquiry today, and thank you for preparing a written statement, which I want to turn to now. For the record, the statement is unique reference number WITN 108000100. Do you have that statement in front of you?
I do.
Now, before we turn to the signature, there are two corrections which we need to address. Firstly, could we turn, please, and have on the screen page 34, paragraph 87. Thank you. Paragraph 87, you refer to the first reference that you've been able to find to Horizon, as it appears in the SHEX dashboard within the pack produced for the UKGI board meeting on the 27th of January 2016. I understand since signing this statement, you've come across some other documents and wish to clarify that position.
Correct. These are all documents that the inquiry already has, but the first reference I would have seen in a SHEX dashboard to a reference to Horizon came via an email dated the 28th of October, to which was appended the October 2015 dashboard for a meeting on the 3rd of November with the incoming members of the UKFI board who were then going to come onto the UKGI board. So that meeting happened on the 3rd of November. We think that that same dashboard was shown to the November 2015 board, but we haven't been able to verify it. In any event, the dashboard dated January 2016 went to the January board meeting, and the wording is exactly the same in the October 2015 dashboard that I saw in November as the January 2016.
So in essence, in this paragraph at 87, you refer to a dashboard which includes the quote there, minimising HMG and Pol's financial and reputational exposure to the alleged Horizon IT issues. And what you're saying today is that you've found an email dated the 28th of October 2015, which effectively included a dashboard with that line in it.
Correct. And the dashboard is dated October 2015.
So for the purpose of the record, the URNs to which Mr. Swannell has just referred are UKGI 30s45534 and UKGI 30s45535. If we could turn to page 38, please. And at paragraph 97, it says on 8th of November 2017, I understand you wish to correct that to the 7th of November.
Correct. The meeting was on the 7th. My note of the meeting was on the 8th.
Thank you. If we could then turn, please, to page 67 of... sorry, if I could ask you to turn to page 67 of the statement. The statement on the screen can come down. Do you see a signature?
I do.
Is that your signature?
It is.
And are the facts stated in that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
I'm going to ask you some questions about that statement, which will be shortly published on the website. But I'll start with your background. Your career history is set out in your witness statement, so I'm going to take this relatively quickly. I understand you initially qualified as a chartered accountant before being called to the bar.
Correct.
You then spent nearly 30 years in investment banking.
Sadly, more than 30 years.
And from 1999, you acted as a non-executive director for several listed companies.
While I was an investment banker, correct.
You were the chairman of Marks and Spencer between January 2011 and September 2017.
Correct.
You joined the shareholder executive as a non-executive director in January 2014.
Correct. That was my first board meeting, yes.
And you became chair of the shareholder executive in September 2014.
Correct.
Were you given a briefing on the post office as a business when you joined the shareholder executive?
Not that I recall.
I want to first look at the role of the shareholder executive. Please could we bring up UKGI 30455953. Sorry, that's my incorrect reference. UKGI 30455954. Thank you. So this is a draft letter in November 2013 from Patrick O'Sullivan, who was then chairman of the shareholder executive, to you with your appointment as a non-executive board member. And attached to it, we see at page 3 are the shareholder executive board's terms of reference. Could we please go to page 4 and down to the bottom? So he says the designated purpose of the shareholder executive board is to act as an advisory board, providing assistance and support to the CEO and helping him ensure that the shareholder executive adopts best practice with regards to governance. And there's then split 3 main areas of activities effectively. See, we have strategy. The first point is to monitor strategic operational risks faced by the shareholder executive in relation to all its activities. And then if we could go over the page, please. Have leadership of specific projects. Now, the reference to specific projects here would include shareholding business, such as managing the shareholder function for post office.
Of course.
And we see there are 2 bullet points there, which I want to take in reverse order. The first is to consider and regularly review the SHEC's risk register, responsibility for which lies with the CEO. So that requires the board to look at the overall risk register for SHECs. Yes?
Correct.
And where it says responsibility for which lies with the CEO, was it the board's responsibility to ensure that, or to hold the CEO accountable so in respect of the risks that were included on the risk register?
It was to ensure that the processes in place were sufficient to provide risk registers that recognise the underlying risks. I think you'll find it in my statement that in my first board, I specifically honed in on the nature of the risk register. And I think I'm right in saying that as a result of that, the shape of from that first board meeting, the shape of the SHECs, as it then was, risk register changed.
We'll come to those in due course. The first bullet point is to assess individual high priority or high risk transactions, projects or other situations where SHECs is actively involved. So that's slightly different, isn't it? Is that where the board takes a deep dive into a particular asset?
Correct.
And was that to ensure that the asset was being appropriately overseen by the executive of SHEX?
It was particularly where the risk register showed that there were particular high risks, either in impact or probability, or mainly both, that the board of SHEX, but more particularly UKGI, because I think the governance of UKGI progressed a good deal from the advisory board at SHEX, had a good handle on what was going on within the organisation.
So I think this is a point you make repeatedly in your witness statement, that those deep dives would be driven by what was included in the risk register.
Exactly.
But when a deep dive was actually carried out, was that to ensure that the shareholder, the executive of the shareholder executive, were appropriately overseeing the asset?
Well, I think the best illustration of that is the point at which I became aware that everything we'd been told about Horizon was incorrect, which was in March 2019. And at that point, you will see that the cadence of deep dives into Pole is extraordinary. And it goes from, as it was, not being high on the risk register, to being the focal point of the board's attention. And you'll see, I think, 4 deep dives, which is way more than any other organisation. And if you think there are 20 plus of them, plus a whole lot of other projects. I mean, remember, at the same time, I think during this process we were undertaking about 50 billion pounds worth of disposals for the government. So alongside those projects, the Post Office had become the most critical aspect, and that's exactly when you saw the board do precisely what it should be, which is taking a high-risk project and having succession of deep dives.
And as I say, those deep dives, and the reason in March 2019 onwards there were the deep dives, was so that the board could satisfy itself that
Correct.
the shareholding interest was being appropriately managed.
Correct.
The board included very senior civil servants, including the permanent secretary to the predecessor departments to the Department of Business and Trade.
Correct. And the second permanent secretary of the Treasury, and as an observer, the permanent secretary of the Cabinet Office.
So the risks or deep dives that were discussed at board meetings would be considered by civil servants at the highest level.
Correct.
And they could be very instrumental in shaping government action in respect of the individual assets.
Indeed, and were.
Could we look, please, at UKGI 30s44314? And go to page 2, please. This is a document that Mark Russell describes in his statement as the SHEX Handbook, published in 2007. If we can go further down the page, please. Thank you. It says, under the shareholder executive model of corporate governance, the government intends to operate as an intelligent and informed shareholder. And then over the page, please. We go down, if you can go down, please. Thank you. So under the title of how the government intends to operate as shareholder, there's the box, the basic shareholder model. And the very last point there is that the shareholder model, the shareholder monitors the performance of the business to satisfy itself that the strategic plan is on track and ensure that any interventions required are well informed and appropriate. The Post Office was managed as an arm's length body, wasn't it?
Correct.
This morning, Mr. Russell agreed that ultimate accountability and responsibility for the activity of an arm's length body rests with ministers. Would you agree?
I would.
you say at various points of your witness statement that the level of government intervention in the operations of an arm's length body can vary depending on the circumstances.
Correct.
And so here, where it says, and ensure that any interventions are required, are well informed and appropriate, is that obliquely referring to this position of the government and arm's length bodies, that it can be further away at points and more involved in some decisions at others?
Yeah, and again, if you want to turn them up, I think you can see this in the 3 last meetings I had with Tim Parker as chairman of the Post Office. I think you'll see from those notes of meetings that in each of the meetings, he says that the UKGI non-exec is being too interventionist, and I'm telling him that he's got to be dreaming, and that in the circumstances in which he now found himself, he should expect the length of the arm to be shortened.
We'll come to those, well, we may come to those meetings.
But I'm trying to make the point.
I appreciate that. Can we turn the page, please, of this document? It says what government expects of its businesses. And principle 1, businesses should seek an honest, open and ongoing dialogue with the government as shareholder. Principle 2, businesses should operate a no surprises policy, ensuring that the government as shareholder is informed well in advance of anything potentially contentious in the public arena. So as an intelligent and informed shareholder, should the government have taken steps to satisfy itself that the businesses it owned were following those principles?
I believe that that's exactly what they were doing. We can come on to whether that was achieved or not.
But as a matter of principle, it's something that the government should have been doing.
Of course.
And we know that Post Office pursued criminal prosecutions and carried out work in relation to post-conviction disclosure as part of the operation of its business. Yes?
I didn't get the last part.
I'm so sorry. I'll break it down into 2 questions. We know that the Post Office pursued criminal prosecutions against sub-postmasters.
Correct.
We also know that it carried out work in respect of post-conviction disclosure, so whether or not documents should be disclosed to sub-postmasters who had been convicted of criminal offences.
I'm not sure what the question is. I know that now.
Yes.
But I had no idea of any of that at that time.
So you didn't know that. When did you become aware of that?
The second part.
Yes.
During preparation for this inquiry. I've said that in my statement. But that's a sort of compendium. Are you referring to the Clark advices, that sort of...
No, I'm not referring to that yet. I'm just asking as a matter of generality, you're aware of those two?
Well, I'm aware of the first point, but I had no conversation, nor was I aware of what I think is the second part of your question.
Do you think that both of those matters were serious matters of which the government ought to have been given adequate information by the Post Office?
Of course.
I want to look at your role as chair now, please. Can we bring up UKGI 30/45955? And usually this is a letter from you to Mr. Russell on the 25th of September. But if we go to page 3, as it's been provided, it sets out your terms of reference as chairman of SHEX. In paragraph 4, please, if you could have that in shot. It says, as chairman, your key role will be to provide high-level strategic direction to the shareholder executive. And the first point is lead the board of directors ensuring their effectiveness in all aspects of their advisory role. And then fourth, develop a constructive, frank and open relationship with the Chief Executive, holding him/her accountable for the effective implementation of decisions. In respect of risk management and the completion of the risk register, what did you see your role as being in overseeing the Chief Executive?
I think there's the formal and there's the informal. As far as the formal is concerned, and again, if you don't mind, I think we should continue the checks through UKGI because it was a continuum. I mean, if you recall, the start of UKGI was only 9 months after my thereabouts, my appointment as chairman of SHEC. So if we can sort of treat them as a continuum. As far as the risk process was concerned, that was something that within UKGI was the prime responsibility of the Audit and Risk Committee, and we made sure that there were frequent conversations about those processes and indeed about the underlying risks. As far as the UKGI board is concerned, again as a continuum, you will see that actually I place risk right at the heart of the UKGI board. And in my memorandum of February 2018, you will see, and you can bring it up if you like, I placed, and there was a real purpose to this, I placed risk as being one of the first items to be discussed at every UKGI board, so that the board meeting would start with the Chief Executive's report. There would be a people report because people were at the heart of what UKGI did. It was a small organisation with a very particular culture that needed to be nurtured. And then there was risk. And the risk part of the UKGI board would be every risk that over the previous month had changed in character would be highlighted for the board, and then the whole of the risk register, the composite risk register, would be set out for the UKGI board. And I did that because I saw that as the best way in an organisation looking after a whole portfolio of interests that you can best direct the board's time to the things that have been flagged, hopefully appropriately, as the highest risk aspects. That's why, post-2019, when we appreciated what we had been told was incorrect by the Post Office, it became the overriding aspect of the UKGI board's time.
Well, let's look at some stages on that, as you described, as a continuum from checks to UKGI. Could we start, please, with UKGI 3016718? So it's a shareholder executive board meeting on the 16th of July, chaired by Patrick O'Sullivan. Your in attendance will be as a non-exec director. If we can go down, please, to risk registers. Paragraph 2.1 refers to significant improvements to a risk register, and Patrick O'Sullivan is recorded as saying that he summarised that the key aim of the risk registers should be to provoke questions and cautioned against making further significant changes. RS, that's you, agreed that it was key that the registers were used to challenge teams as to their understanding of identifying relevant risks and their mitigants, and added that it would be helpful to identify other organisations with a similar risk profile and to learn how they recorded risk. So from this, is it your position that one of the uses of a risk register is actually to challenge the executive team on whether or not it is identifying the appropriate risks.
Correct. And in fact, just to go to 2.1, the revisions is what I was referring to earlier. So I've been on the board now since January, and hopefully we've already got a better risk register. I don't know why it said RS agreed. I don't know what I was agreeing to. I think I said.
That document can come down now, thank you. Moving forward to the 24th of November 2014, I think that's your first board meeting as chair. I was going to say board meeting of shareholder executive. Can I at that stage ask a couple of questions about your knowledge of various matters? Can you remember if you were aware of Second Sight's interim report?
Absolutely not.
Were you aware about the Post Office and governance announcements in relation to the mediation scheme?
I wasn't.
Were you aware that the CCRC had been corresponding with Post Office regarding past convictions?
I wasn't.
I was about to ask about a review of past convictions and disclosure. You've already said you weren't aware of that. Do you think you should have been made aware of those matters?
I think to say that I should have been made aware, means that you have to have assessed that the people who should have made me aware were themselves aware or should have been aware. And obviously it's quite difficult for me, looking back to 2014, to know whether those people should have been aware, or if they weren't aware, should have made themselves aware. I mean, I can give you a longer answer to this, because it's right at the heart of the whole issue. But how do you want to take it?
Let's break it down. With the first question is, if everyone in the chain is acting in the way they should have been acting, from the Post Office executive team to the board, should you have been made?
Yes.
Yes. Where do you think the problem was in that led to you not being aware of that issue?
I think, and if you ask me about what I think went wrong, you'll hear these two words mentioned a number of times. I think it was a mixture of culture and curiosity. And by culture, I mean, in my view, and again, if you look at all of the board discussions of UKGI after the period that we had really got stuck into this, because we became aware of it after the March 2019 judgment, there is a lot of discussion about culture. And there's even a discussion between me and Tim Parker at one of our sessions about culture. It's clear to me, it was clear to us then, and by then I mean in 2019, that the culture at the Post Office was shocking. And by that I mean it was a closed, defensive culture that was not in the business of giving information. I can't tell you whether information was withheld deliberately or whether they simply didn't give it. But whatever the reason, there were a whole range of things that should have been known to the board of the Post Office, and then therefore to the SHEX UKGI board member, and as a result of that to the UKGI board. And had it happened, you would have seen exactly what you saw in March 2019. We would have been on it in spades. And, sorry, the second point is curiosity. And I'm afraid that when an incomplete curiosity, if I can put it that way, meets a toxic culture, bad things happen.
When you say lack of curiosity, is that in the Post Office alone?
I didn't say a lack of it, I said an incomplete.
Sorry, okay. The criticism you have regarding curiosity, is your criticism solely of Post Office, or is it internal within SHEX as well?
Well, it's of the Post Office, but we have to acknowledge that Sheks had a member on the Post Office board.
We'll explore those matters as we go through the timeline as well. Could I look at the, say we go to the 24th of September board meeting, could I look at a spreadsheet, please, which is UKGI, I think it's a spreadsheet, sorry, UKGI 30166864. So I think it's a spreadsheet. Some of these are spreadsheets as documents. That's why it might take some time to get them on screen. So we see in the very top left, this is a document for the Sheks board, 24 September 2014. It's been zealously redacted. I think if you don't see the redactions here, what you see is on the heat map, as it were, there would be other UKGI or Sheks assets listed at various points of the register. Is that right?
Correct.
And when you refer to the risk register at the board in your statement, are you referring to a document like this?
Correct. I'm quite surprised, looking at that one, at the absence in the top right-hand corner. It must have been a particularly good month.
What we see left is we have a scale of impact. What does that measure?
The impact of whatever the risk is.
And the bottom is probability, so that's
Correct.
the likelihood of it happening.
Yeah.
If we can zoom in, please, on the narrative box at the sort of bottom right centre. Sorry, bottom left centre. Thank you. So it says Post Office, overall risk profile, RA, that red amber. And it says, if not managed successfully, collectively the risks have potential to significantly impact the commercial strategy and financial sustainability of Post Office Limited, jeopardising the long-term policy objectives of transformed network, reduced Her Majesty's government funding and mutualisation. So this says what the potential effects of risk are broadly, but it doesn't expressly identify what the risks are, does it?
No.
From reading this, the potential risks do seem significant.
Well, not especially in the way that it's positioned in the risk register matrix. No. I mean, it's clearly much less of a risk with impact than many other of the Sheks entities.
Pausing there on that point, is it fair to say that shareholder executive managed, the assets it managed were generally high-risk assets?
They were, by definition, normally high-risk assets, because assets that were in a steady state, like Companies House, went back to the department from which they'd come.
Is there a problem with focusing on the relatively highest risk assets in that pool? Because assets which, by ordinary standards, would be high risk aren't given attention.
Not really. I think all of the assets in the Sheks portfolio got attention.
Under reputational risks, it says there is a significant political interest in the Post Office network, and there are a number of policy objectives in connection with the network which need to be delivered by the end of the current Parliament. The Sheks Poll team are aware of the pressures and are working collaboratively with Post Office Limited to manage risks away. Again, this doesn't identify any risk expressly, does it?
No, it doesn't.
And it doesn't say how the Post Office team are mitigating the risks.
It doesn't.
So does this risk register raise more questions than it actually answers in respect of Post Office's risk?
It certainly raises questions, yes.
Were questions asked about Post Office's risk at this board meeting?
I'm afraid 10 years later I can't answer that.
That can come down, thank you. Could we please look at...
I suppose the only point I'd add to that is that, there's no question that we improved the governance of UKGI over the period from there, which is my first, I think that, was that before?
Your first as chair.
My first board as chair, to the period where we started to focus more particularly on post office and risk. And you can see it, I mean, the discussion of risk would have been explicit because of the way each of the board papers on risk were set out. So it would have been almost impossible to have such if you like, an imprecisely described risk in the new regime.
Could we just look, please, at UKGI 30166783? So this is a board pack for a UKGI board meeting on the 16th of May 2018.
Yeah.
Could we look at page 23, please? Another case of zealous redactions. We see on the left UKGI reputational risk, and on the bottom UKGI delivery risk. Is that delivery?
Delivery of the policy objectives.
Just as a broad point, how does the human impact issues of allegations of unsafe convictions fit onto a scale such as this?
Sorry, the UKGI, that is delivery of the objective of the underlying entity.
Yes, my question is, if UKGI were presented with the risk of Post Office Limited having secured unsafe convictions...
Well, it would be about a 10 on reputational risk.
So that would be a reputational risk?
Well, and a delivery risk. I mean, delivering the Post Office objectives and convicting wrongly sub-postmasters is clearly not compatible, is it?
In your witness statement, you refer to this document. We don't need to turn it up. It's page 39 of your statement, paragraph 101. This is showing the new format of the board pack with a more prominent risk register shown in its new position. Is that, are we talking, this is the document you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about the board paper, which if you scroll up, you'll find.
So is that the narrative board paper which sets out when risks change?
It's the board paper that comes at about item 4 on the board agenda and introduces changes in risk or any other comment on risk. If you want to turn to it.
Well, I think we'll come to that shortly. Okay. There's a significant amount of redaction in it, but we'll double check where it is and come back to that. Could we just...
It's quite important because this actually, May 2018, is the first implementation of the new style of board agenda.
Could we just turn over, we will come to that, could we please turn over the page, please? And again, at the, if we can zoom in on the post office box. So we've got the delivery risk profile and the reputational risk profile. Reading those, again, those don't identify expressly what the risks to post office are.
That is true, but you have to take this also in the context of the board reports that would have been coming to the board about Pol. I think I'm right in saying that between the time that I went on the board of SHEX and the March 2019 turning point, there were 8 times in which Pol was referenced in the Chief Executive's report. So this isn't in isolation. There would have been discussion and information about Pol in other ways.
And
by the way, pretty much all of those 8 references in board papers were about the funding and commercial agreement arrangements, which were at that point pivotal. Well, they were existential for the Post Office.
yes, and of course your evidence is that the horizon-related risks weren't included on the risk register for the board until 2019.
Correct.
So with the transcriber in mind and the early start, I think it's probably a good time to take our afternoon break there.
Yeah, say for this, Mr. Swannell, by 2018, the group litigation was actually in being. So I was just wondering whether there was any separate process by which your board, if I can call it that, was being informed of what was occurring in the group litigation.
It wasn't.
So there was nothing. Fine. Okay. Yes, we'll have our break now. What time should we resume again, Mr. Stevens?
If we could say 3:15, please, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I want to just pick up on the board meeting pack point, please. And if we could bring up UKGI 16783 at page 4. I was asking you questions about the risk register that the board were relying on. This is the contents of the pack. And we see at 6, the Chief Financial Officer's update, 7, risk register review, 9, students' loans, 8, NDA project review. And at the risk register review is said to be page 23. If we turn to page 23, that is the document we were just looking at. What other document were you referring to?
It would be about a 3 or 4 page document which would set out any particular issues that needed to be highlighted and any changes to the risk rating of any of the underlying entities. So if you go back to the agenda.
Yeah, page 4, please.
You will see that it's in this case, it's a 3-page document.
Well, as you see, if we go back to page 23,
I can't.
That is the.
I mean, I've looked over the last weeks at lots of.
Can I ask you? Let me ask you it in another way. Can we go to UKGI 30/45959? This is...
That's it.
So that's dated for the 29th of November 2008.
Yeah.
just so we're clear, we can figure out what documents went where on
Correct.
the documents themselves, but that is the type of document
Exactly.
we're referring
Exactly.
to.
And I don't know how long that one is, but they're normally 2 to 4 pages.
If we look at page, well, let's just look at this. It's the 29th of November 2018, so just before the Common Issues trial. Oh, sorry, the Common Issues trial is effective upon the Post Office. If we look at page 4, please, right at the bottom.
I think I refer to it in my witness statement. I think the risk was reduced for Pole.
Yes, well, we're just going to look at that now. So it says Post Office Director Tom Cooper, delivery risk, red amber, no change. Reputational risk, medium, decreased from high. Change due to improved performance, making Post Office Limited profitable and therefore increasingly self-sufficient financially. Again, this document wasn't highlighting expressly what the risks to Post Office were, was it?
Correct. So I think I've made that plain in my witness statement, that the first reference to Horizon is in January of 2019.
Yes, that document can come down, thank you. Why did the board think that that type of information was sufficient to challenge the executive on whether it was identifying risks appropriately?
Sorry, I don't know. I don't know exactly what. Normally, there would be some narrative in the reference to the changing of the risk. You took it down before I saw anything. Was there nothing there?
Well, we can bring it back up, please. It's UKGI 30/45959. Page 4, please, at the bottom. And then if we can go over the page, please. It's been marked as irrelevant.
I can't answer that. I can't recall why that would have been sufficient or what the context was at the time or what was said at the meeting. I think it's a perfectly fair question.
But you can't assist us with...
I can't, no.
I want to go back in the... just so we can pin down what the board actually had. Please, could we bring up UKGI 40/2488? This is an email at the bottom we see from Emma Lee to James Bohr and Richard Callard, CC'd in. So we're now commissioning updated registers from all teams for September. I've attached your latest risk register for you to update. It says, please forward me the updated file by close of play Friday, 3rd of October. Now, earlier I was talking about a board meeting, your first board meeting of chair on the 24th of September 2014. So this is forwarding a risk register, a Post Office Limited risk register that was in play before your first board meeting as chair. I don't suggest you've seen this email before, it's just to place it.
I've seen it when you disclosed it a few days
Sorry,
ago.
I'll rephrase that. Yeah. You haven't seen it when at the material
No.
time. Can we bring up the attachment to that email, please? It's UKGI 40/2489. Mr. Russell's evidence this morning was that this type of detailed register was not provided to the board.
Correct.
Would you have ever seen a detailed register such as this for Post Office Limited?
No, the first time I saw this or anything like it was in preparation for this inquiry.
If we could scroll down, please, to risk 11. See Project Sparrow. At the time, would the words Project Sparrow have meant anything to you?
No.
We see it says the risk overview, the working group is unable to progress cases and the process is publicly criticised by applicants and the JFSA. And if we look at mitigation overview, Checks is ensuring POL closely engages with the members of the working group and seeks to address issues over the operation of the working group if they arise. And further mitigating actions, provide robust responses to queries about the working group, stating the findings of the initial review, that there are no systemic issues, it's referring to the Horizon interim report, and that there is an independent chair. Caution needs to be exercised to ensure that the independence of the chair is not undermined. Do you think that Sheks's involvement in issues like the mediation scheme should have been raised with the board?
I think with the benefit of hindsight and all that we know about what was not known at the time, clearly the answer is yes.
Earlier, Mr. Russell was discussing the fact that the risk that wasn't recognised was with the IT system itself and the risk of unsafe convictions.
Correct.
Do you think that should have been identified as a risk by shareholder executive at this time?
Again, I think you're asking me to put myself in the mind of somebody 10 years ago to know what they should have known and or did know. I mean, all I'm telling you is today, looking at the facts that we do know, we should have known about this.
And if at this stage, information about the interim report and the mediation scheme and Sheks's involvement in that, what do you think would have happened at board level if that had been raised?
Exactly the sort of thing that you saw raised from March 2019 onwards.
So a deep dive?
A succession of deep dives. Had we known all of the facts, I mean, the truth is, as far as I can see, and this is what I talk about incomplete curiosity, nobody at any point in this had ever come to a conclusion on the totality of the Horizon system. And so when I talk about incomplete curiosity, I include in that not following through to a conclusion as to whether or not Horizon could or should have been relied on.
So if this had been raised to your attention at this time, when the working group was in action, would you have counselled to see it through, as you describe it, or to try to come to a final conclusion?
Look, it sounds very clever after the event for me to say that, but I would have wanted to know that there was a conclusion, and whether I would have commissioned asked for the commissioning of a further independent report, I simply can't tell you, but that would be the natural thing to see through. And that, as far as I can see, is what did not happen here. So, again, I've sort of shorthanded for you the issue of culture and curiosity, but that's part of the incomplete curiosity.
I want to move on slightly now. We've looked at what documents the board had before it. We'll come back to that in due course, but just to keep things chronological, I want to look at some meetings you had with chairs of Post Office. And in your statement, you said that you would meet with the chair of Post Office once a year, roughly.
Sometimes more, but roughly, yeah.
You say that you would not describe it as part of an oversight role. You say it was explicitly intended to get feedback on UKGI performance in its role as shareholder.
Correct.
In your experience of acting as chair or a non-executive director of other businesses, have you ever had a role like that?
Like what?
As a chair in meeting members of a business you're overseeing, purely to see how someone you're responsible for was performing?
No, because I've never had a role that occasioned it.
Could we please...
And by the way, the only experience that I could possibly have is as the Senior Independent Director of 3i Group. And 3i Group was a venture capital and private equity organisation with many underlying investments. The chair of 3i would never have met any of those underlying investments ever. So, in a sense, this is over and above that.
Please can we look at, I want to turn to your meeting with Alice Perkins on the 8th of April 2015. And we can, if you look at your briefing first, it's UKGI 30-45533. So if we could just get all of the points to consider raising aspect in. We see there are 4 headings: board review, future challenges facing Post Office, CEO and management capability, and Post Office's relationship with government. And the bold text sets out matters on which you might ask questions. For example, board review, you might consider asking Alice about her views of the evaluation. This briefing goes beyond merely this being a meeting for you to ask how UKGI officials are performing.
Of course.
So this was an opportunity, was it not, for you to discuss business issues with...
Of course. I mean, it would be extraordinary to go into a meeting with the chair of the Post Office and say, how's our person doing? And then end the conversation.
So if we look at paragraph 1.2, so after almost 4 years as chair, Alice will be leaving in July. It would be useful to ask her for her honest reflections on the challenges going forward, including what she would like her successor to address. In your statement, we don't need to call it up, but it's page 32, paragraph 82. You say, I do not have any record of my meeting with Alice, but I think it is unlikely we would have discussed Horizon.
Correct. I mean, I think this is the only meeting where I don't have a meeting note after the meeting, and I regret that. I also actually regret that the follow-up meeting that I had suggested never happened, and I set that out in my witness statement.
So this is the chair of Post Office, and her chief executive, Paula Venables, had just 2 months before this meeting appeared before a select committee to discuss matters arising from Horizon. Why do you think it's unlikely that you wouldn't have discussed Horizon, or she wouldn't have raised it?
Because I think I would remember it. Well, I think I'd remember it if she had, but I mean, in truth, I can't remember. So I can't categorically tell you.
Can we look, please, at another one of the more detailed risk registers? It's UKGI 404686, and this is first an email.
By the way, the reason that I surmised, I think I said in my witness statement, that I hadn't talked about Horizon is because Horizon wasn't mentioned in the briefing note, and therefore there was no particular trigger for it. But that's the best I can do.
This is an email from James Ball to Richard Callard and others on the 25th of June 2015. It says, we've been asked to provide an updated risk register by 3rd of July. The latest copy is attached. We see the attachment is risk register June 15. If we could open that risk register, it's UKGI 404687. If we could go to page 2, please. We have the same detailed risk register as before. I understand your evidence is that you wouldn't have seen this at the time. If we can go, please, to risk 11. So we have Project Sparrow. If we can make that line bigger so we can read it, please. Thank you. It says, increased attack from JFSA against Post Office on alleged faults with Horizon system, including attempts to derail the mediation scheme set up to address individual cases. And then on mitigation actions, shareholder executive is ensuring Post Office Limited addresses issues as they arise and is seen to take the lead on this matter. Important that the mediation scheme remains independent of government. And you'll see at the further mitigating actions, respond to queries, especially from MPs and Parliament, maintaining schemes' independence from government, and the fact that no systemic issues with Horizon have been identified. And then it refers to the CCRC. It says, take legal advice on CCRC investigation and ensure all relevant documents are saved. And we see the risk rating for reputation and finance, the probability and impact is 4 each, you see in the middle. Can you translate that to us as to what that's saying with a risk rating of 4?
It's 80% of the highest.
Would you have expected this report to be submitted to the Audit Committee of Shareholder Executive?
Again, I think it would depend. It would depend on the knowledge of the people compiling this at that time. Are you saying because it's a 4x4 that it should have been discussed?
Well, that's my question, yes.
I'm not sure necessarily with the Audit and Risk Committee. The Audit and Risk Committee was responsible for setting the processes and agreeing the processes by which the risk registers were compiled. Actually, although perhaps not in this, which year is this?
Sorry, this is June 2015.
I mean, there wasn't, obviously there wasn't a board in 2015 with an Audit and Risk Committee. So actually these issues would come to the board if they were thought to be of sufficient severity. And I mean, I think I can only give you the answer that I gave to the question that you asked of the previous risk register, is that if we had known what we know now, or if the people compiling this had known what we know now, then clearly this should have come to the board. And I say that, I mean, I say that explicitly in my witness statement.
Yes, well, this is referring to the CCRC being involved, so involving the investigations into whether convictions are unsafe, the serious issues that are raised, and the probability and impact score has been 4 for each. Now, you've reviewed the documents, as you say, and you've produced a witness statement to help with lessons learned. What, in your reflections looking back, what do you think went wrong that meant these risks quantified at 4 for impact and probability weren't raised with the board?
Well, I'm just trying to understand this. There's probability. I'm finding it quite difficult to read the writing, but isn't that a 3 in the risk?
No, so we can go to the top to show this. On the left-hand side, there's 4 and 4, and then on the right,
Look,
3 and 3.
I think the simple answer to your question is if you're asking me, do I think that if the scale of the issues then confronting the post office had been known to this team, that they should have escalated it in the risk register? The answer is yes. And that's, I hope, what I've said in my witness statement.
Yes, and
I think I said could or should.
my question is, having reviewed this in detail as you have, can you help us with looking at, in terms of the process, why it wasn't raised when, on the face of it at the time, the unmitigated risk on the left was assessed at 4 for probability and impact?
I can't help you, no. I can't put myself in their minds.
Do you think the board could have taken more steps to ensure that risks such as this were appropriately raised to it?
No, because I think the answer is the processes that were in place were, which is a monthly, and again, happy to go through it, but a monthly evaluation of the risk register was as good a process as you could have, and I think is as good a process as any company that I've seen. What is missing here is either the knowledge or the judgment to put that risk in context. And that's why I've said in my witness statement, I think quite clearly, could or should have been drawn to the attention of the UKGI board.
And when you say knowledge and judgment, whose knowledge and judgment are you referring to there?
Those who are exercising the judgment on these matters. But I can't, looking back, I can't put myself into what their knowledge was, and I can't tell you in a sort of mathematical way whether every risk that is rated at that number should be escalated to the UKGI board. If you ask me the question, if you knew that there was a serious risk of wrongful prosecution of one or more post offices, sub-postmasters, then of course that's a matter that should have been raised with the UKGI board.
Please can we look at a different document, which is UKGI 3020145. So this is a shareholder executive dashboard. It's from January 2016. Earlier in your evidence, you referred to it being sent to you in October 2015.
Correct.
It's neither here nor there for these purposes, really. If we look at, please, page 3. We see the post office, that we've got governance top priorities and some bullet points here. For you as chair, for what purpose did you use this document?
Well, as I say in my witness statement, I didn't use it to calibrate the risks. What I used it for was as a very handy way of looking at what the underlying issues were in the 20 plus entities and many more projects that were being undertaken by UKGI.
We looked at the risk registers earlier, which didn't set out the risks in any great detail. So when you read, we see minimise HMG and POL exposure, brackets financial and reputational, to alleged Horizon IT issues. What did that mean to you?
I can't tell you exactly what it meant to me in January 2016, but clearly, well, actually, I say clearly, I don't think by then I had been briefed for any chair meeting, including references to Horizon. So I'm not sure what it would have meant to me. And I have to say, I mean, obviously I look at it now and I wonder whether it should have, and I reference this again in my witness statement, whether this should have prompted me to ask many more questions, but on the face of it, it didn't. And by the way, it didn't for one of the most experienced boards that I've had the privilege to work with, including 3 permanent secretaries.
You asked that was my next question. Is at any stage up to this point, had the permanent secretaries asked any questions at board level about Horizon issues?
No, nor did that one line, which isn't particularly explicit, nor did that give rise to conversation. But again, remember that the context for this, I think I've said already, there would have been 8 chief executives report before we get to 2019, referencing POL, but not referencing Horizon.
Can we look, please, at UKGI 30020297? I want to look now at some of the meetings you had with Tim Parker. So this is for a briefing for your meeting with Tim Parker on the 19th of July 2016. UKGI provided metadata for this document, suggesting it was dated the 6th of July 2016. Page 3 of the briefing, please. It says, Tim may mention legal action being brought against Post Office in respect of its IT system Horizon and the claims that it wrongfully prosecuted/sacked a small number of agents. Tim has undertaken to review the matter for the Minister, but in the face of High Court proceedings now being launched, they may need to reconsider. Knowing what you know now, do you think that accurately reflects the status of the litigation?
I mean, the answer has to be, knowing all that I know now, no.
In your witness statement, you refer to a briefing with Laura Thompson, Richard Callard, Justin Manson and Tim McInnes on the 13th of July 2016. Yes?
Correct.
Did at that meeting or briefing, can you recall discussing the Horizon IT system?
I've no idea. I'm sorry.
Do you think before this you were aware of the allegation that Post Office had wrongly prosecuted/sacked a small number of agents?
Again, I'm sorry, but it's very difficult for me to remember precisely when, in a period over the last 8 years, I knew. I say in my witness statement that I have to assume that I knew at this point, because that's the earliest that I probably could have done. Whether I did or not, I don't know.
With you being aware of this allegation, can you explain why you didn't take steps to see that this allegation of wrongful prosecution, why that wasn't included on the risk register?
I can't explain, no. I think I would say that this is a 3-page note and this is the last item on it, and that puts it in some context.
Well, it says it's an allegation of wrongful prosecution. That's a serious matter, isn't it?
It is, if I understood what wrongful prosecution meant. And I can't tell you whether I knew at that point that the Post Office was a prosecuting authority or not. I can't tell you.
Would you accept, based on being on notice of there being claims of wrongful prosecution, that you should have done more to see that this allegation was put on the risk register?
I addressed that full on in the witness statement. It's hard to know in the context of all of the other things within UKGI whether this is the one that I should have alighted on and didn't. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, as I say, I would wish that I had. I didn't.
Could we go, please, to UKGI 30166783? We went to this document earlier. It was the board papers.
Yep.
Could we look at page 101, please? There we see it's the UKGI dashboard, April 2018. If we can go, please, to 105. And his third bullet point down refers to civil litigation judges that Post Office Limited has acted inappropriately, or I think that would be illegally, on the Horizon case. Can you recall whether this this risk on the dashboard was picked up by the board?
It wasn't, or it would have been mentioned in the minutes. But remember, the dashboard was not presented for discussion at the board. It was presented for information. And as I've said to you, and I make clear in the witness statement, it would have been inconceivable to me that a matter referenced at, I think you say, page 100, as a for information item in the dashboard would not have been included in the risk register if it was a matter of deep concern.
But we looked at this document and saw what was in the risk register didn't actually identify what the risks were. Yes?
What I'm saying to you is that for the board was given two documents. One at page 100 is the dashboard, and secondly is the risk register. And it would have been inconceivable to me, looking back, clearly I was wrong, it would have been inconceivable to me at the time that a matter that was of deep concern and a grave risk should be mentioned in the dashboard, but not drawn out in the risk register and positioned in the risk matrix.
One of the board's roles, well, it's right, isn't it, that one of the board's roles is to challenge the executive and see that the appropriate risks are being identified.
Correct.
The risk register we went to earlier didn't expressly set out what the risks were.
Correct.
There's a for information piece which provides a bit of detail on some of the risks. Do you agree?
I agree.
Was it not a failing of the board to fail to not spot this and see that the civil litigation and the underlying issues were put onto the risk register?
I mean, I can tell you that the board did not, and it was a very experienced board. If you want to say that was a failing, that's a matter, obviously, for judgment by the inquiry.
Could we have a look at another meeting you had, please, with Tim Parker? It's UKGI 408374. It says challenges and opportunity. Sorry, just so you see at the top, it says briefing for meeting with Tim Parker, 11th September 2018. Under challenges and opportunities, it refers to the litigation, and the final sentence of that paragraph says UKGI have not yet been satisfied that the business has done enough to identify, assess and manage the risks. Do you recall your thoughts when you read that?
I don't recall my thoughts when I read that, no. I mean, I've put some context about this in my witness statement if you want me to refer to that.
Well, we have your witness statement to ask you directly. What do you think you would have thought, having read that, the fact that UKGI were not satisfied that the Post Office had done enough to identify, assess and manage the risks of the litigation?
I was aware by this point that Tom Cooper, who was the new director on the board, as a result of the when I say I was aware that there was a much greater degree of engagement by Tom Cooper in relation to this litigation, of which, of course, I was aware at this point.
And so if we look at the bottom, is that what this is referring to? While we have a strong relationship with both Tim and Post Office's CEO, Paula Venables, there has been some recent tension with specific individuals pushing back at what they see as undue interference.
Yes.
Do you know who the individuals pushing back were?
No. I can only assume that Tim must have been one of them, because whether in that meeting or the 2 or 3 subsequent, I think at various points he talked about trampling over the undergrowth or excessively executive behaviour of Tom Cooper, and I increasingly pushed back on that.
Are you effectively being asked here to step in and assist with UKGI satisfying itself as to whether Post Office has identified, assessed and managed the risks?
I don't think so, no. Do you want... Could I see the end of the paragraph?
Over the page, yes, of course.
No, I mean, at the end of it, it says it would be good to get Tim's take on this. So I'm being invited to get Tim's take, not step in, I think.
Did you consider at that point it to be a significant risk to the business that a significant risk to shareholder, to UKGI, that it had not satisfied itself as to Pol's identification of the risks in the litigation?
I was aware of the escalating view from Tom Cooper, and again, I couldn't precisely tell you when, that Pol were not sufficiently engaging in contingency planning, and in particular for the possibility of loss.
Could we look, please, at UKGI 3045945? This is your email of the note of the meeting with Tim Parker.
Yeah.
Was there no discussion of the litigation at this meeting?
I can't tell you. All I can do is refer to the note. I'm afraid my memory doesn't go beyond that.
So your best recollection is, well, sorry,
When
you're
was-
limited to this note.
When was the meeting? I can't recall.
The meeting was, sorry, bear with me, 11th of September.
So it's 3 days later. It's my best recollection.
That document could come down, thank you. Please, could we...
But again, you see his gripe is about the interference.
Please, could we turn to UKGI 16800? This is the board pack for the meeting on the 29th of January 2019. Could we turn, please, to page 55? Actually, could we start with page 50, please, actually? Sorry, can we start with page 50, please? So you see, this is one of the risk register review papers I think you were referring to earlier. And if we just scroll down the pages, well, we can take it from me, it's all marked as irrelevant. So that paper is
Okay.
nothing of relevance in there. Could we then turn to page 55? We see that's the risk register with Post Office Limited towards the top right. And then if we turn, please, to page 61. Under reputational risk, we now see that it says there is an ongoing Post Office litigation case which could potentially generate a high level of negative coverage. Do you recall what had happened that led to this being included in the risk register?
I don't. And again, I think it's surprising, but probably just an error that there was no reference in the risk paper to the change in the rating of the risk.
Was there any discussion at the board of the addition of the litigation case on the risk register?
No, and again, as I said in my witness statement, I think, again, it was a very unusual board. The entire board of UKGI had gone to Sellafield for that meeting. The great preponderance of the meeting was about the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, as you would expect, and there was another major item on the agenda. And I think it's probably the only time in my that I can recollect where I'd have to go to the minutes to be clear, but I don't think the risk register was taken in its normal order and context, because it was, in fact, in my entire time at UKGI, the only board meeting that took place outside the offices of UKGI at Sellafield.
We then get to March 2019, and that's when Common Issues is handed down. And in your witness statement, you say that from that point onward, Post Office and the issues surrounding the Horizon IT system became a top priority for the UKGI board and also for me as chair. I want to look at a lessons learned document that you refer to in your statement, prepared by UKGI. The reference is UKGI 30048173. So it's a draft of the document dated the 28th of June 2021, and I understand that you agree with the recommendations within the report. Is that right?
I was instrumental in its preparation, yes, and in its discussion.
Can we look, please, at page 2, paragraph 2.4? At the bottom of 2.4, it says, the degree of control and oversight that government has over a public corporation should be both reasonable and proportionate to the public corporation's functions and risk profile. Accordingly, what is appropriate in terms of oversight is subject to change. As Post Office's risk profile has increased, so too has the degree of oversight exercised by government, which I think a point you made at the start of your evidence. We've seen that the underlying risks of the litigation have been known by the shareholder executive for years. Would you agree?
Correct.
Would you accept that the handing down of the common issues was an example of a risk materialising?
It was, for me, it was more than that. It was, again, I haven't referred to it because as far as I can, in my witness statement and now, I have tried to rely almost exclusively on written evidence because I find it very difficult to know at what particular point in a 10-year period that you knew something, so it's better to rely on written evidence. But for me, the common issues judgment, and I'm making a personal statement here, provoked an utterly visceral reaction. I had heard for the previous N years, there is nothing wrong with Horizon. 6 million transactions happen every year. There are 11,500 branches where mostly it happens. There's never a problem with the Crown. But again, I'm giving you anecdotal stuff here, not evidence by writing. But I can tell you that's what I'd heard. And I suddenly see this common issues judgment, and again, I can show that it's visceral because, as you know, I got this email about the common issues judgment at 8 o'clock on a Friday while I was on holiday, and I replied to it by 9:21 saying what my views on it were. And I can tell you, and anybody who's worked with me understands this, when I start an email saying, this does not look at all good, it means a great deal more than that in the sort of language that I tend to use. I then go into a series of issues about whether lessons have been learned from the Magnox episode. And from that moment on, including the recusal, I was absolutely on it, and I could almost say obsessively.
In your evidence, you were explaining the visceral reaction because, and you referred to being told, the transcript's gone, but I think you said for years that Horizon was okay, it processed 6 million transactions. In what context did you receive that information?
Look, I was chairman of UKGI. Again, I've tried in my witness statement only to set forward evidence that is backed by writing. But of course, as chairman of UKGI, as I set out in my witness statement, I spent a lot of time in the organisation listening, and it would be impossible over that period not to pick up some of that background noise. I can't tell you precisely which years I would have heard that, but I did hear it. And actually, the one thing of all of them that stuck in my mind that I would have been told at some point, I can't recall when, was the view of the National Federation. And again, I can't tell you when that was, but at some point before 2019.
Did you rely on what you were being told about Horizon being okay and it processing 6 million transactions in deciding whether or not the Horizon-related issue should go on the risk register?
Do you mean, was it background noise in looking at the risk register? I'm sure it would have been. But again, I can't tell you exactly. So you showed me the risk register in 2015 and you've shown me the risk register in 2016. I can't tell you at which point I knew or heard a particular thing. It might have been in 2018. I really don't know.
At any stage before common issues, the handing down of common issues, were you told of the allegation that Fujitsu could remotely access branch accounts?
Never heard that. Had no reference to it at all.
Do you recall having any conversation about criminal convictions with anyone in UKGI or SHEX prior to common issues being handed down?
Criminal convictions. I knew that I must have known there were prosecutions.
We went earlier, we referred to wrongful prosecutions, but
Correct.
Aside from that meeting I took you to, can you recall any other conversation?
No.
In your witness statement, you say that it's significant to note that the role of the shareholder changes when the underlying company has effectively betrayed the trust that its shareholder has put in it. What role does trust have in a shareholding relationship?
It has a huge role in assessing. I mean, that's why I started by talking about culture and curiosity. Culture in an organisation and your feel for it is utterly pivotal in how you behave as a board member. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of boards, either as a board member or as an advisor to a board. And you can, with experience, you can quite quickly get to an understanding of culture and therefore on trust. And that's why I think the trust that a board has with its chief executive and a shareholder has with its board obviously changes over time. What I can't tell, because I have no experience of it, is what sense of trust the poll board felt about the executives who were reporting to it, and in turn because my connection with the poll board was a once-a-year meeting with the chairman, it's pretty difficult for me to give a view on whether there should be trust between the shareholder and the board. But trust is utterly fundamental to the relationship. When trust goes, everything changes.
I think it's important we cover some of the recommendations with you. So there are factual parts of your witness statement which I'm not going to cover, but let's turn to look at some issues to do with recommendations. Could we please bring up your witness statement at page 22, paragraph 54 to 55? If we just get up 55, that would be. Thank you. You say that you believe that arm's length bodies have an important part to play in the governance of state assets. It allows His Majesty's government, to set policy and objectives and appoint a board of suitably qualified people to achieve those objectives. Clarity of purpose can be achieved through a framework document and chairman's letter. Oversight on good governance can be achieved through the role of His Majesty's government as shareholder with the framework document, articles of the entity, and through representation on the relevant board. The most important tools for His Majesty's government in this arrangement are the approval of the key board appointments and ensuring that the chair and CEO are rigorously and regularly assessed against their objectives. Who within government was responsible for the rigorous and regular assessments of the chair and CEO of Poll?
Amongst others, Sheck's UKGI would have been.
And was that a clearly understood role within the shareholder executive?
It would have been part of the arrangements, yes.
Are you aware of what systems were in place to ensure that there were rigorous and regular assessments?
Yes, and they were reported to the board, as I've set out in my witness statement.
From your position looking back, do you think there are any changes that needs to be made to those processes?
I can't tell you because I haven't seen and wouldn't expect to see the appraisal of the chair or chief executive of the underlying entity and what came out of that and what the consequences were.
Can we look please at page 65 of your witness statement? Paragraph 167. So the most effective control of any arm's length body is through very clear policy objectives and through framework documents and agreed strategic plans and agreed objectives, priorities that set out very clearly the way in which the body is to operate at arm's length and how its governance should work. Who was responsible for setting the objectives and monitoring whether Post Office met them?
It would be a range, I guess, of both policy and financial objectives. So it would be officials from Sheck's UKGI and from the business department.
Looking back as you have done, do you think that the setting of objectives and monitoring was satisfactory?
It's quite difficult for me. I mean, the answer is the outcome was clearly wholly unsatisfactory. What I can't do is put myself in the position of all of the information known to people at the time. I mean, my assumption has to be no in relation to this aspect that we're talking about.
If we turn over the page, please, to page 66, paragraph 169. the last sentence, you say, in my view, the most important lesson to be learned is how to properly train boards and their members to ensure continual curiosity and to develop a culture to allow that curiosity to make a difference in board effectiveness. Can we infer from this that your view is the core issues here was a lack of skills or training on the part of the directors of Post Office Limited?
Well, again, let me just go a bit deeper into this. My view, again, and I repeat it because I think it's utterly fundamental to this, is the culture at the Post Office and on its board was not good. The result of that was that information flow was imperfect, to put it mildly. I can't express a view on quite how imperfect it was, but it clearly was imperfect. And again, I go back to the central point on curiosity and follow through, that ultimately the issue here is that nobody ever ultimately bottomed whether or not Horizon was as it had been stated to be, even though there were, as I now know, although was not aware of any of them at the time, there were many studies that looked and talked about things in probably quite imprecise ways that people didn't fully understood, like systemic, and I could go into more detail. I think I'd add one other thing, and we haven't touched on it, but the truth is that once the Post Office had got into the position where it was faced with this very complex piece of litigation, I think they, as would many boards, were not well equipped both to understand the technical and legal aspects of that litigation. And if you recall, we haven't touched on it today, but one of the other things I did immediately after the settlement in December 2019 was to get a further litigation protocol put in place, because I thought that was so important. Now, it isn't often that boards are faced with a piece of litigation that's quite so existential, but my observation is they weren't well equipped to deal with it.
On this point here, you've identified an important lesson to be learned on properly training boards and developing a culture to allow curiosity to make a difference. In your reflections, have you thought of any practical steps that could you, what are they?
I mean, putting culture at the heart of every organisation. It's no accident, and I'm sorry to sound a bit passionate about this, but I am. The first board meeting of UKGI in January 2016, item 1 on the agenda was culture. And the reason for that is I thought it was so important. And if I talked about culture and openness 10 times, I talked about it 1,000 times. I took every opportunity at UKGI to talk about it. And there's no reason why every board and every company shouldn't put it at the heart of what it does. Again, it's no accident that before every UKGI board meeting, the newest recruits to the organisation came to the board just with the non-executives on their own and talked about why they were there, what they hoped to achieve, what they'd found good, what they'd found bad, and allowed us to talk about culture. And, you know, I've been going on about this for a decade now in various different guises and organisations, and it's fundamental to how boards work. And without it, even good curiosity isn't always successful.
You, in your witness statement, you advocate for to keep the model of arm's length bodies as a model for assets such as the Post Office. the inquiry is going to hear from a number of witnesses in the coming weeks who make various suggestions on how that may be changed. One suggestion would be that a minister should be empowered to become directly involved in the decision-making of a board and direct the Post Office Board on how to make a certain decision. What would be your view of that?
Again, I may not have the precise technicalities right, but it would surprise me that a minister didn't feel able to get their point of view across under the current architecture, either by putting it within the framework document or simply by exerting the power that the 100% shareholder of any entity has. I mean, put it this way, I don't think that Blackstone or KKR would feel the need for legislation to let their underlying entities know what was going to happen.
Finally, when Shareholder Executive became UKGI, the responsible department for the transferred from the predecessor to DBT to UKGI being accountable to the Treasury. Yes. Do you think anything different would have happened if the body managing the shareholding interest for the Post Office, so UKGI, was accountable directly to DBT or its predecessor?
Well, in respect of its work with Post Office, it was accountable to DBT. I don't think the shareholding of HMT made any difference in that. And throughout, the permanent secretary of DBT was on the UKGI board. So Alex Chisholm, or before that, Martin Donnelly, Alex Chisholm, and then Sarah Mumby.
Thank you, sir. Those are all the questions I have. I'll just check in the room if there are... No questions from core participants, sir.
Well then, thank you very much, Mr. Swannell, for taking the time and trouble to write a detailed witness statement and for answering questions this afternoon at the inquiry. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you, sir.
So we'll resume again tomorrow morning at 9:45 with Mr. Cooper, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Fine.